Question: where did the Bible come from? Well, we know today the Bible contains really two sections. One is the Old Testament and one is the New Testament, and it's perhaps Bible is the most widely circulated or widely sold book in history ever. It's been translated into more than 2,400 languages, and it just reaches everywhere in the world. It certainly is one of the most extraordinary books ever written and sold and distributed in this world. Well, who wrote the Bible and when? Well, let's look at this in two sections, although the Bible really should be looked at in one complete book. But let's start with the Old Testament. The Old Testament part of the book was written in the Hebrew language originally. Well, except for a few passages, it was written in Aramaic, but by and large, it was primarily written in Hebrew. And this part of the Bible was written in a period of about 1,000 years. And the first person in the Bible that is identified as the writer, the first writer, was Moses. He is actually credited with authoring all of its first 5 books of the Bible. And Moses wrote that around the 1500 to 1200 BC. And it was Moses who literally collated all the historical happenings that started from creation to Noah's and the flood and to Abraham's journey. And Moses documented all those. The Old Testament today is comprised of about 39 books, 5 of which, as I mentioned earlier, was written by Moses. And then you have 12 books that were historical books. And these books were actually used by current historians as a standard to check their historical records. And there are also 5 books of poetry, and there are 17 books of major and minor prophets. These prophets essentially told the future in their prophecies. Then you have the New Testament, and the New Testament was written after Jesus died and rose again and ascended to heaven. So it would have been written around the 100 AD period, if you like. And this is the time where it was at the peak of the Roman Empire. And at that time, the major language used was Greek and Aramaic. And most historians would agree that the Apostle Paul or the apostle who wrote the New Testament would have written it about 20 years, very close to 20 years after Jesus' death and resurrection. And in the New Testament, we have we call the 4 Gospels, which is Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And there is a bit of a disagreement as to who actually wrote those Gospels, but it's a consensus of opinion that the apostles named in that Gospel, who were Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, actually wrote those books. The New Testament, as I mentioned just now, was written around the 65 AD to about the 90 AD, and it included about 27 books in all. So the whole Bible, both the New and the Old Testament added together, amounts to 66 books. They wrote the Bible on various materials. They wrote it on clay, on stone, on metal, and papyrus paper. And papyrus were essentially 2 layers of split papyrus reeds that was found in the shallow waters of the Nile. They literally pressed together and they made a form of a paper sheet. And it was written on those papyrus papers. And also perhaps on vellum made from calf skin, parchment, from lamb skin, or from cowhide. So those were the substrates that was been written on traditionally. Well, that's one remaining question then. That we have identified somehow, very briefly, where the Bible came from and who wrote them. Then the follow-up question would be, where did the words of the Bible come from? The best explanation would be in the New Testament, in Hebrews chapter 1, verse 1 to 2, I quote, "Long ago, God spoke many times and in many ways to our ancestors through the prophets. And now in these final days, he has spoken to us through his Son." Unquote. In short, the Bible words were written by the inspiration of God. And what is it used for? Basically, God used this medium to teach us, to correct us, and to prepare and equip us for what is to come in the very, very near future. So the Bible it comes from God. They are his words put in writing, written by a select group of people known as prophets or apostles. They wrote the scriptures as they were guided by the inspirations of God. So the Bible was not written by humans, although human hands wrote them, but the words and the knowledge and the thoughts were guided by God through the humans, translated into the Bible. So it's an inspiration of God. Over the centuries, there were about 40 different prophets and apostles who wrote down these words for us. And the authors were from every walk of life. There were shepherds, there were soldiers, there were prophets, poets, monarchs, scholars, statesmen, masters, servants, tax collectors, fishermen, and even tent makers. And the words were written in a variety of places: in the wilderness, in a palace, in a dungeon, on a hillside, in a prison, and even in exile. And it's penned on continents of Asia, which is really the Asia Minor, where today would be Turkey and Syria, around that area. And it was also written in Europe and also parts of Africa. That, in short, was where the Bible came from.